for Wednesday, August 30th, 2023. It doesn't really seem like August. There's been so much going on. I've been to 2 trade shows, and there's news in this field every week, it seems. And today we're going to be talking about a very newsy topic. So Build America, Buy America. But before we get to our main topic and our incredible guests that we'll be hearing from, I want to give everyone a little bit of both a background and a foreground for events to come. Those of you who follow us very closely, broadbandbreakfast.com, we believe in better broadband, better lives. And we do these weekly free Broadband Breakfast Live online events. We also do in-person events. And our event just 2 months ago was on Made in America. It was the Made in America Summit. And we talked comprehensively about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, about the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course is really about green energy, and about the semiconductor promotion in the CHIPS and Science Act, connecting the threads of these different pieces, why they are so important and how they connect to one another. We actually had a very robust discussion at this event 2 months ago on Build America, Buy America, with a number of industry officials from the Telecommunications Industry Association, the Fiber Broadband Association, and the Wireless Internet Service Provider Association. And I may refer back to that when we get to questions for this session, because again, it was very topical, very looking forward about a problem that many people were concerned about. And now that there's news, there's actual draft waivers out there, we can talk with perhaps even greater specificity about the kind of pros and cons of that topic. But I want to call your attention to that because that's an example of the type of events that you would know about 2 months ago if you were following our Broadband Breakfast events. We just had that event, Made in America Summit, and Broadband Breakfast Club members can watch the videos from that event. We are coming up next month on another such event. It's the BEAD Implementation Summit. It will be here in Washington at Clydes of Gallery Place on September 21st. Registration's available for $145 until Friday. Okay, that's when our early bird registration ends, the end of the day on Friday, September 1st, and we will be, it'll be $245 for the summit after that. Now it's an all-day event, so you'll get lots of content, and we've been able to announce that we are really looking forward to our keynote speaker, Evan Feinman, the Deputy Director of the NTIA's BEAD program, and he's just announced that he'll be keynoting at the BEAD Implementation Summit. All of the panelists that we have confirmed are on the page, broadbandbreakfast.com/BIS for BEAD Implementation Summit. I'll put that in the chat as soon as I have a moment from these introductions. And really excited about this event and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in person. We will have a registration live stream for that, but we'll announce that next week. So I just want to kind of get that on your radar. Make sure to mark your calendar, Thursday, September 21st. And it's the day before TPRC in Washington, which I know many of you are interested in as well. I also want to point out one more quick thing for those of you who register for the BEAD Implementation Summit. We're offering a package of 3 incredible reports. The first one was on state broadband directors and how they were viewing the initial allocations to their states from BEAD. The one that's just been published last week was on kind of a background for pre-BEAD programs. And the one we're going to release next month will be on matching funds and kind of a primer on what you need to know for matching funds. So that's kind of our event that's coming up. We hope to see as many of you as possible. Also, we are continuing our Broadband Breakfast Live online. Next week, we're going to be talking about what's new in broadband mapping. The week after, we have a really special discussion that I know many of you have signed up for. You have to use a special sign up for this Broadband Breakfast Live online event on September 13th. It's the CEO of Gigapower, the co-venture, the joint venture between AT&T and BlackRock, and we're also going to have the president of AT&T, AT&T's broadband and connectivity initiatives, as well as the managing director of BlackRock Infrastructure. So we're super excited about that event, talking about what Gigapower says for the future of open access in the United States. And then we'll be previewing the BEAD Implementation Summit at a future Broadband Breakfast Live online event. Well, that's enough for me right now. I want to open it up to all of our panelists. I am so happy to see that all of you are live with your cameras and speakers. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. Robert, if you are able, if your video and audio are working fine, and it looks like your video is, we'll go ahead and go back to the order we were talking about. Let me just give a quick primer on who we're going to be hearing from and remind you that this issue has been one of the biggest controversies of the last 6 months in the BEAD program because of very widespread concern about the Build America, Buy America requirements ever since the State of the Union address, when we heard President Biden double down on Made in America, specifically cite fiber optic cables as a reason why these kinds of construction projects need to be made in America. Our industry has been really concerned because while fiber optic cables aren't necessarily scarce in the United States, fiber electronic equipment has been. And that's what we're going to, I'm sure, talk quite a bit about here today. A draft waiver was released last week, 8 days ago on August 22nd. We've reported about that on the 22nd and the 23rd. Will Arbuckle of NTIA spoke about this at Fiber Connect last week. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But for those who aren't, I'm sure we'll get a little bit of a primer up to speed. We've also highlighted in our description for this discussion that there has truly been a wave of activity in domestic manufacturing and the market for fiber, electronic, optical equipment. And companies including Nokia, CommScope, Corning, and others have detailed investments to bring electronics and fiber manufacturing back to the United States. I'm not pretending this is a comprehensive list, so Robert and Bill, feel free to tell me everything you're now doing or have always been doing in terms of Made in America. But let's talk now to our 4 panelists. We're going to hear first from Robert Conger, who's General Manager of Software Platforms and Strategy at Adtran, which of course is a very significant equipment provider for the industry. He'll be followed by Lori Adams, Vice President of Broadband Policy and Funding Strategy at Nokia, which almost needs no introduction, but has become very, very active and vibrant in this space for fiber optic and electronic equipment. And we will hear then from Bill Sproul, yes, that's right. Robert, Lori, then Bill. And Bill is a broadband stimulus expert who leads DZS's outreach efforts to federal and state broadband funding programs. And DZS, of course, another very significant manufacturer. We look forward to hearing from each of these 3 industry folks. And then to throw the bombs, we have Scott Walston. No, just kidding, Scott. No, Scott, I've known for many years. He's got always a bit of a contrarian view. Don't shy away from that, Scott. But at the same time, look forward to hearing your unvarnished thoughts about the Build America, Buy America requirements and how industry and others are adapting to them. So with that, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Robert, and take it away. Tell us the view that you at Adtran have about this program.
Sure. Thanks for that intro, Drew. Hopefully everything audio is okay now. I had to switch to the iPhone, the Zoom app. I was having a little bit of trouble there with the MacBook, but yeah. So Adtran, we're a little bit unique in this space. I mean, we've actually been doing domestic manufacturing. We're headquartered in Huntsville, Alabama, and right there at our headquarters campus, we've had a manufacturing facility now for nearly 30 years, and pretty much every OLT system that we've built, from the beginning of time, has been built right there in that factory. I mean, when we look at Bob, so today, our product portfolio spans everything from the optical core, optical transport equipment, out to the customer prem for business solutions, residential connectivity. So pretty much everything you need to connect homes, businesses, and 5G sites with fiber, that's in our portfolio from the active electronic standpoint. So yeah, what we look at the BABA waiver, and it's really an extension of what we're already doing. So we're already building OLT systems, already doing some cabinet enclosures. So this is just kind of extending it into optical pluggables and ONTs that would sit at the customer prem. Historically, yes, those have been manufactured in different facilities, but we would be onshoring some of that. And as part of that onshoring effort, we did announce 2 weeks ago an expansion of that facility that I was talking about in Huntsville. So we'll actually be expanding that to kind of address this growing, I guess, broader portfolio that needs to be built here in the U.S. But, from our standpoint, this is something, if you told us that, hey, you guys need to be ready this year, no problem, we'd be there. So it's, maybe a little bit unique in that situation, but yeah, for us, it's it's more just an extension of what we're already doing.
Would you mind just speaking very briefly, Robert, about the core products that you make that serve? Let's just focus on fiber optics. Okay. Again, I recognize there are other technologies, but for the purpose of the question, tell us just a little bit about what Adtran makes and what you are making in the U.S. that you might not have been doing, 2 years, 5 years ago.
Yeah. So the scope of the waiver that was announced last Tuesday that you referenced, that as it relates to our product portfolio would include the OLT systems, which are the fiber access platforms, not just the electronics, but also the optical pluggable modules. Optical pluggables would typically not be manufactured in the U.S. The OLT electronics were, in our case, that's not necessarily the case with everybody else, but certainly in our case it was. The OLT pluggables would not have been, and those will be now onshored. And then there is the ONT that sits at the customer prim that terminates the fiber. That would typically have not been onshored, but now would be onshored. And then there's the cabinet enclosures, which we actually had already doing some manufacturing of the cabinet. So this would usually be like a cabinet enclosure for the OLT system in the network to sit in. That kind of enclosure, some of the materials and the manufacturing of those systems would need to be onshored. And that one for us is kind of a mix, some onshore, some offshore. And so that would be, all of those cabinets, including some of the enclosure materials and stuff, would be made to manufactured in the U.S. So that's kind of the scope from our perspective. Okay. The other things like Wi-Fi and transport and other stuff's kind of outside the scope of the waiver.
All right. Well, thank you for that quick summary. Let's now turn to Lori Adams. Huge announcements this month from Nokia, and walk us through, how that came to be and how it kind of fits in with the way the draft waiver comes out, Lori.
Thank you, Drew. I'm so happy to be here today to finally talk about this with some degree of certainty. As you know, we've had many conversations over the last year, 18 months regarding this issue. And so we're, grateful to be at this juncture. So before we get started into the topic of the day, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself and Nokia. I sit in the government affairs team for Nokia, but I spend almost all of my time working with the business and sales teams on creating and implementing our broadband strategy. I've been in the industry for more than 20 years and have extensive experience with grant projects, building and directing the Maryland BTOP project, and consulting with rural communities across our country, helping them find workable broadband solutions. I joined Nokia 18 months ago, not because I wanted to sell cell phones, which we don't really do anymore, but to work for a technology manufacturer with a complete portfolio of solutions for every type of broadband network. 7 out of 10 fiber broadband connections in North America are actually made through Nokia equipment. And Nokia was at the forefront of PON development and today is the #1 provider of XGS PON technologies. But moving on to our Buy America. Our journey with Buy America started over 18 months ago. So Build America, Buy America is a critical part of the infrastructure bill passed by Congress and signed by the president. And we took the Build America requirements very seriously. We believe the administration and agencies when they repeatedly told us they would not issue a blanket waiver for BEAD. And Drew, you referenced in your opening remarks the President's State of the Union. That was really, a point where it became clear what the administration position was. We leaned in and spent thousands of hours examining supply chains and products. We talked to customers and almost all of the states and other stakeholders to make sure that our decisions were informed and appropriate for BEAD. And our announcement on August 3rd with the Vice President and the Secretary of Commerce represents Nokia's commitment to onshore fiber broadband products for the BEAD program. that consist of the OLT line card for a modular OLT, a more pizza box OLT for smaller deployments, a hardened outdoor ONT, and an optics module. But just to be clear, Buy America isn't about being an American company. It's about establishing manufacturing of specific broadband products at scale to meet the unprecedented demand of the BEAD program. And our Buy America products will be available in line with the first expected BEAD awards in mid-2024. With the release of the waiver last week, we are pleased to say that our U.S. products are fully compliant, and Nokia looks forward to providing certification to NTIA of that fact once the waiver is final.
Awesome. Wow, Lori, a lot that you've covered there. And obviously we'll get to more specifics, but can you just walk us through a little bit of that thought process that you referred to with the State of the Union six months ago? What was it that kind of maybe changed in terms of like what could be possible once you sort of once the company recognized, hey, we really have to lean into this?
So, it was about a week. Once I picked myself off the floor, after the State of the Union, I knew the president was going to be talking about this, but it seemed so much more emphatic than I was expecting. So, about a week later, I was on a call with a trade association with all of the leadership of NTIA. There were probably 60 or 70 people on this call. And, the topic of Buy America, of course, was first and foremost. And the message coming from NTIA at that point was very clear. They stated something to the effect of, look, we have to find out what is possible. We won't be issuing waivers until we explore what is possible. And, we looked at the two prongs of the Buy America test, right? There's two parts of it. 55% of the cost of the components are sourced in the U.S. and is manufactured in the U.S. And manufacturing is more than just assembly, by the way. It's not just taking a couple of bag of screws and throwing it onto something. And it's more meaningful than that. And so, we really took that to heart. And the administration was clear that they needed to have some onshoring. It was going to be required. And so we really kind of dug in and worked hard to find a way to make it work.
Thank you. We'll come back to this, of course. Let's turn now to Bill Sproul. Tell us a little bit about DZS and your view on this process here.
Sure, happy to do it, Drew. Thanks for having me on the program today. Just a little background on me. I've had, like Lori, decades of experience in the telecom industry. In fact, I live here in the Dallas area, and part of the area is known as the Telecom Corridor, and I ran that for about 20 years. And when Texas began to look at its broadband strategy, and it really had none, our Governor Abbott, appointed me as the first chair of his Governor's Broadband Development Council, and it gave me the opportunity to help craft the Texas strategy that created our first broadband office, our first broadband plan to fund. In fact, our voters are going to vote on $1.5 billion broadband proposition this November. And so I actually tried to retire about a year ago, and I failed at it. Some of my old board members called me up and said, Bill, you know this stuff better than anybody. Why don't you come help us out? And one of those was Charlie Vogt, the CEO of DZS. And so I said yes. So DZS is a U.S.-based manufacturer of broadband access equipment for both last mile, middle mile optical transport, customer premise equipment, and all guided by an AI-enabled software overlay. We had never left the U.S. We had manufacturing operations in Seminole, Florida, for well over 20 years at scale. And we built OLTs and ONTs for the U.S. market there. Earlier this year, we started to transition that manufacturing to our contract manufacturing partner, Fabrinet, in Santa Clara, California, where they build our OLTs and our optical transport equipment. We still have a big supply of ONTs that we made in Seminole left over. So I can tell you that today, we are the only one who has BABA compliant OLTs, ONTs available right now today. So, we're ready to certify. The waiver we thought was well crafted. And I want to give big thanks to Will Arbuckle and his colleagues at NTIA for, really thoughtful and thorough job of trying to understand our industry, trying to understand the products and the nuances. the challenges that we're facing on electronics and, supply chain, et cetera. And so, we think actually it's a good waiver. And we feel that we're completely compliant with it, and we're happy with it. There's a few nuances here and there that we could get into about it. But for the most part, I think it addresses a lot of the concerns of the industry.
Okay. Well, thank you for that background. And let's move to Scott. Scott Walston. First off, tell us, Scott, your familiarity with this issue and what you think specifically about the waiver that's been released last week.
Right. Well, thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk with you and be on Broadband Breakfast. So actually, first, when Bill said he tried to retire, it reminded me of Airplane when, he said this picked a bad time to retire. You got to come right back in at this point in time, biggest subsidy program ever. But I think we need to back up a bit and think about Buy America within the context of BEAD. The goal of BEAD is to build as much broadband as possible. That is what BEAD is supposed to do. Every condition you put on it, no matter how good you think that condition is a cost to BEAD and means less broadband will be built. You might think the condition is the best thing in the world. And when I read through them, I agree with a lot of them too. But that will increase costs. If it didn't increase costs, you wouldn't need it as a condition there. And we've seen not a single cost benefit analysis to tell us what the cost will be from all of the conditions. Now, that's not a criticism. It's not a criticism of NTIA or anybody on this panel or anything like that. Congress put it into the law, and everyone's got to try to work within it, right? But it's important to back up and to remember that, because the goal here is to build broadband, and we want to build as much of it as possible. Now, in terms of, we see that the costs are already high for the things for the inputs that we'll need to build broadband. And of course, a lot of the spending hasn't even happened yet. Optical fiber, according to the BLS, the producer price index of optical fiber is up 15% since last year. For optical fiber manufacturing is up almost as much since last year. I imagine some of the companies here probably see the cost of their inputs being higher. Wireline networking equipment is up, not as much, but it had not been increasing for years, decades really, until now. And all of these things are going to make it harder to build broadband. And so, it's good that the NTIA is working on waivers. But in my opinion, of course, they should have a global waiver for everything. Obviously, I know that's not politically possible, but you want to have a waiver for as much as possible, including, I would say, already made fiber optical cable. Now, let's look at, just take Nokia, for example. It's great that they're investing here and opening a plant because we need that fiber and so on. But that's still more expensive than it would have been for them to provide fiber, with other facilities, because if it weren't, they would be investing here anyway without Buy America. And maybe Lori will say that they were, in which case that's great too. But that's just an example of how Buy America increased the costs. And we want to be cognizant of that. And we want to make sure that NTIA understands that and remembers that we want to get the most broadband possible. And there are other aspects that's not necessarily Buy America, but that are constrained by policies. We know that labor is the key, is probably the biggest component of building out fiber. We have the most construction jobs open now in the history of collecting that data. Wages are up a lot for construction workers, which is great for them, of course, but it's another thing that increases costs. Not clear what commerce could do, but it's an immigration issue. We should allow more immigration to help with this. There are lots of things that are increasing costs that we want to deal with, and it's good that NTIA is dealing with them. But we need more. And in terms of, in a broader sense, when you look at the research that's been done on these programs, and Buy America programs have been around forever, they end up being costly. A study by the Peterson Institute a few years ago found that it was equivalent to a 25% import tariff, which translated into a 5 to 10% price increase to consumers. And that they ultimately, over time, they didn't create new jobs. We would have created more jobs without these programs. And so these are all things to think about. And again, it's not criticisms of anybody. except for Congress, of course. But and everybody else has to deal with it, and we do the best we can with it. But it's important to keep all this in mind and what we're really going for, which is more broadband.
So, Scott, the political environment between now and the BTOP program, 10, 12, 13 years ago is different. We're in a more populist environment, right? More kind of protectionist, even, if you will. Not necessarily saying all this is protectionist, but there's certainly that element. And when the Obama administration, did the BTOP program, some of these laws were already on the books, but there was a rather sweeping waiver for the BTOP program. Were you basically thinking that would be repeated again? What would be your kind of counter to this sort of sense that, well, we just can't, let other countries make all these construction projects?
I wouldn't expect that there would be a broad waiver as there was in BTOP. I would like there to be a broad waiver like there was in BTOP, but you're right, it's a more populist time now. And so it's not going to happen, but that's what we should go for. These arguments are, people always make these arguments when they want to promote such programs. We can't afford to let such and such be built elsewhere. Countries try this constantly. It never works. It always leads to higher costs. And it's generates large political benefits, and which is why we keep doing them over and over again. But they do not do the things that people say they will. Now, there's a caveat here, which is, like, if we were to talk about chips, for example, people do make good arguments about national security issues with semiconductors and not wanting certain Chinese networking equipment in our networks. And right. That's an issue. And I think that, there are some China-specific provisions in the waivers too. Sorry, that they'd not be included in the waivers. Right. No, exactly. And so those are hard to think about in an economic sense, because it's hard to quantify what those risks are. But at least those are coherent arguments. Whereas just we can't afford to have something made elsewhere, I feel is not.
Okay, so we're going to.
Can I react to this? I feel a little compelled.
All right, quick reaction. Go ahead.
Well, I think there's three things to observe. Number one is that, our fastest growing markets in North America, we manufacture here in the U.S. and we're selling in the U.S. So that obviously hasn't been an impediment. The second is that we found that when we shifted some production over to Fabrinet in Santa Clara, California, despite what you might think about the operating costs there, they can produce twice as much with half the resources. They're highly efficient, and they're a great partner of ours. So and I think the other thing that you just need to be aware of is that a lot of our customers like the fact that we produce here in the U.S. We're more responsive, we're closer to them, they can come and see our plants. I think those are all arguments in favor of why U.S.-based production is a good thing, and that it's not just an increased cost.
So Bill, let me say I fully agree. When you can produce here, it's great. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but if everything you're saying is true, that would happen without a law. You would just do it anyway. You're giving market reasons to produce in the U.S., which are awesome, which are great, but when they're true, you don't need the law to make it happen.
Well, we have we have large markets overseas, particularly in Asia, in South Korea, and in Japan. And we produce different products over in that portion of the world for those markets, just like we produce products for the U.S. market here. So, it's all about regionalization and regional economies. But
those are all market reasons. That have nothing to do with Buy America. Well, unless you're responding to laws that they have, in which case, again, those are market distortions.
Well, there's no obligation for us to have to produce those products in those markets. We're not being compelled to do that.
And that's great. We're not really disagreeing in that sense.
So I want to go to some questions we're getting from the audience. In particular, is it possible to provide an overview of what the waiver includes and what is excluded? And another saying that this waiver is rather dense reading. I'm going to do my quick first take on, and then I'd like everyone's reaction. So what is, the waiver has three parts. This is, again, Drew's summary. Okay, so take it with a grain of salt. one, what is blanketly waived? Okay, and that's things like semiconductors, right? Because the NTIA concluded they were not produced in capacity to make it work in the United States. The second category is things that were not waived, but there's some allowances or some specificity. And these are 4 specific items, including the OLTs, the ONTs. I want to, again, hear our panelists speak about these 4 specifics, but there's also a kind of a change on the 55% threshold. So I want to hear about that. And then the third thing is things for which there's nothing was waived. And I think fiber cables fits into that, right? Again, unless I'm misreading something, fiber cables, there's no waiver, so they must be produced in the United States. So let's go through the order we've got here. Robert, Lori, Bill, and Scott, just reacting. How would you summarize the core components, what is included and what is excluded?
Yeah, I think you just hit them. From our perspective, it's really just comes down to the OLTs, the pluggable optics that go in those OLTs. So this is the aggregation platform when you're building a fiber access network. Any cabinet enclosures that you place them in, and this is from active electronics perspective. So that cabinet enclosures, and then the ONTs that terminates the fiber at the home. Those are the main pieces. Everything else is kind of outside the scope of the waiver and doesn't really have any Buy America stipulations. The other big part, obviously, is this is more for the Cornings and CommScopes of the world, that the actual fiber itself, like you mentioned, still has a Buy America component, and any kind of like splitter enclosures, other enclosures that you would see in the outdoors, to house this infrastructure, that would be the waiver. The rules would still apply to that. So that's it, right? So I mean, we're not talking about the optical transport systems, the Wi-Fi in the house yet.
Fair summary. Lori, what would you add to this?
So I would add to this that you have to look at this in conjunction with what the purpose of BEAD is. BEAD is a fiber first program, and if you look at this waiver, there is a broad waiver given to every electronics that are not fiber based. So if you're talking about fixed wireless, whatever it is, routers, aggregation routers, things beyond kind of the access pieces, they are all waived, presumably because the volumes don't make the case, the ROI for establishing manufacturing. But because BEAD is a fiber first program, and as many states, some states will have as many as 85 to even 100% fiber deployments, close to 100%. You look at those 4 products, and what they did was they waived the 55% requirement. There's two criteria for BEAD. One, the 55% requirement, and the vast majority of the cost of components in broadband electronics are semiconductors and chips. So you can understand why they waived the 55%. Then you look at the manufacturing processes, and what they said is these can and should be made in the United States, and they defined what those manufacturing processes should look like. So if you really look at this in that lens, you see that the waiver is really a broad waiver for all technologies except for fiber. And then for fiber-based technologies, it waives the 55% and requires manufacturing of those 4 products.
Okay. No, thanks for detailing that and laying that out. And again, the waiver does go through some degree of specificity on these 4 things. I'm just going to read them out: optical line terminals and remote optical line terminals, OLT line cards, optic pluggables, and optical network terminals, ONTs, and optical network utilities. Those are those 4 categories that are kind of the bulk of that waiver is about the specific rules around them. And these are the ones, Laura, you've just mentioned are necessary for fiber, and this 55% threshold has been waived. So I want to maybe in a moment understand a little bit more about that process, but let's give Bill and Scott an opportunity to weigh in on like your take on what the waiver does, the draft waiver does.
So without the waiver of the 55% component cost for particularly ONTs, I doubt that you'd see a lot of manufacturers onshoring the production of ONTs into the U.S. It's a commodity. A lot of them are built over in Asia. And, we will be obviously shifting, production of ONTs to the U.S. That currently built by our partner Fabric and others over in Asia. The rest of it, though, again, makes perfect sense to us. We're still building OLTs here and OLT line cards. We didn't talk about it, and it's really not the subject so much of this waiver as it was another for the NTIA middle mile program, but the whole optical transport piece of equipment that is really, key to broadband deployment. And it has a waiver, a very broad waiver that's in effect for 1 year, I think until March of next year.
Okay. Scott, quick reaction, then we'll drill in a little more here. But and by the way, for those who are watching, please send your questions. We're happy to take them, incorporate them. And we've got some questions we're rolling with, but we want to hear yours and incorporate those into. Scott, what do you make of the waiver? Have you read the 9 pages? What do you think of it? You're on mute, Scott.
Right, that's a key part of every discussion on Zoom. To talk on mute. So I agree with all the details the other panelists meant. I mean, their businesses depend on knowing those details. They'll certainly know them better than I. So because you've asked me to be provocative, I will be a little bit even more here. It's we know the what of the waivers, but it sounds to me like the why of the waivers has a lot to do with the lobbying that happened behind the scenes. And what we've seen is that these waivers reduce costs for fiber optic manufacturers here, but they do not actually cover the fiber optic cable, so you can't import that. If we really cared about just decreasing the waivers are still good. Don't get me wrong. Every waiver is good. But if we wanted to really reduce the cost of fiber, we would just have a waiver for that itself too. So we got something that really helps the fiber manufacturers here, but not as much the customers as it could. So I'm being extra provocative, I hope.
Well, let me put the extra provocative in a bit more context. Each of the 3 of you companies, Nokia, Adtran, and DZS, are global in the sense that you provide, I'm certain, products to many countries. And we had a little bit of a sidebar earlier, Bill and Scott, about like making regional products. Like, how do you deal with this? Like, is every country wanting a made in America, made in France, made in Scotland? I mean, like, how do you deal with this kind of national tone to demands, and how do you strike that right balance? Again, everyone, whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, that's a question I won't answer, but
I think
it's not for you, Scott. Other people.
Yeah, we're not seeing like this made in Europe. Well, I should say, okay, the semiconductor crisis, the supply chain crisis the last few years did definitely raise the kind of importance of onshoring certain critical communications infrastructure. I mean, to Scott's point, chips, there was a lot of good parts of chips of like, hey, we need domestic fabs because we can't depend on all of the critical fab capacity being in Taiwan. What if an event happened in the future with Taiwan? We'd have this huge dependency on everything from car makers to communications equipment, et cetera. This is clearly not stated explicitly, and I'm not trying to wade into the political waters here, but there is some undertone of like, it's one thing to have chips, but if you don't have domestic manufacturing capabilities of critical communications equipment, that's clearly a gap as well. And so there is some aspect of that, of just building up the scale and capacity of the domestic manufacturing base. That's kind of a side benefit of this, and something that's being pushed, although maybe not as explicitly as it was with chips. I think that is an aspect here. Europe, there are programs, and we have a lot of facilities in Europe. We just are in the process of completing what we call a Terafactory, which does a lot of optical transport onboarding in Germany. And so yeah, we have factories there as well in a kind of a different scope. And there's a lot of subsidies and other things to help, get that infrastructure built. Maybe not as explicitly as the Buy America type situation, but certainly there are some incentives that those countries are putting out as well to onshore anything that's in this critical. They have their own chips bill in Europe as well. So, I mean, there's some of the similar things happening.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in here. Nokia is a global manufacturer. As an industry, it's taken decades for our supply chains to develop and move overseas and mature. And it's difficult to move them on a dime. To your point on, for legislation that passes in the U.S. or Canada or Scotland, which is a favorite country of mine to visit. But, we have to keep in mind too, the geopolitical issues that surround the manufacturing of high-tech equipment. I mean, you look at what we've done, right? Chinese companies are not allowed to sell into the US. We have a rip and replace program going on that's sorely underfunded, right? Because we do have some Chinese equipment in our US networks that need to be ripped out and replaced with US equipment. So, there's a lot of movement at play here, and it is hard to establish, to move supply chains on a dime. But, for as far as Nokia is concerned, right, we are pleased to be able to help move the US manufacturing and help secure our supply chains with some of this, with really high-tech establishment of a high-tech ecosystem here in the United States.
Bill, do you want to add anything briefly?
No, I think we're kind of beating that horse.
We got some good questions here. So this is from LinkedIn. Thanks for your questions, whatever platform you're coming in from. Do we know if there's plans to include Canada and Mexico in Build America, Buy America materials? And this is an interesting question. I haven't heard of this as much, but like what about these free trade agreements that many states had? This was a discussion point I've heard a lot over the last months, but not as much in the last month. So could you talk a little bit about other countries besides the United States and besides kind of China, like whether it's close, Canada, Mexico, or maybe, South Korea, Taiwan, et cetera?
Those are explicitly, those trade exemptions are not allowed in this rule. So I know there's obviously different trade agreements. Historically, that was the case. Like if you did RUS loans and stuff, they had different Buy America rule sets. And then you had all these trade exempt countries that, whether it's from the EU or Mexico and Canada, et cetera. That does not apply here. So it does explicitly have to be in the US. I think they understood that if they kept those trade countries in exemptions in place, that the rule would be negligible value.
So just to kind of throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into this, a week, 10 days ago, a couple weeks ago, OMB issued their pre-publication volume of their Buy America guidance for IJA programs, all the infrastructure bill programs relating to Buy America specifically, not BEAD specifically. And one of the things, one little note in there, they talk about how there is wiggle room for states to request exemptions that would interfere or contradict their free trade agreements. So there is a little bit of wiggle room if you read this in conjunction with the OMB guidance that applies to all the programs, but it's unclear exactly how that would work for BEAD, how a state would apply for an exemption based on a free trade agreement. But I just wanted to make note that there is that exemption in the overall general guidance.
The other thing to remember is that, a year is a lifetime in politics, and there's a general election coming up next November. So, we could be revisiting this waiver and the program depending upon the outcome of that election. And then, there's the real implementation of BEAD, and what really happens on the ground. And will we need to revisit this waiver? Will we need to think about expanding, the list of countries that, where we source materials that are considered U.S. content to include Canada or Mexico? So there's just all sorts of vagaries there that I suspect that we'll be revisiting sometime during this 5-year waiver period.
That question opens up an even bigger issue, which is that, we have to deal with the broadband component because that's our area. But this is a much bigger issue that we're backing away from free trade. I mean, it was also part of the Inflation Reduction Act that, we put tariffs on European products. And for decades, we moved towards free trade, and it brought tremendous economic benefits and growth, also costs to people, no question. But beginning under the Trump administration, we started pulling away from the world. And even though the Biden administration hates nothing more than being compared to Trump, they've continued it. And it's, as an economist, it's not a good trend. I mean, it's also difficult for all the companies because you've got to navigate both incentives and punishments from different countries, and it's a difficult political landscape. But just as an aside, it's not a direction, as an economist, I like to see.
in the Zoom questions, we're getting a big thread about costs. What is the cost difference for certain scenarios? How do we know? And then we actually have some answers here, at least proposed answers from Amit Patel, basically saying, by most industry estimates, the fiber to the home electronics represent 5 to 10% of the total project build, with fiber and trenching being the majority. And then this commenter is basically guessing that this represents a 5% increase in project costs by making electronics 50% higher. Now, these are off the cuff. These are one commenter. I have no idea if these are accurate, but I would like to ask our electronics manufacturers, what do you think about the cost impact that these rules will impose upon BEAD projects?
I think it's negligible. There's zero cost. I mean, we've been, like I said before, all the OLTs and stuff been building forever in the US. There's zero impact there. The ONTs, there may be a modest one, but I think if you look at the numbers, I mean, there's 42.5 billion in BEAD to serve 12 million homes roughly. So it's about $3,000 per home on average. All of that's largely going into construction and stuff. The electronics piece of that is very, very small. Even if I added, let's just say hypothetically $20 or something in electronics cost or something per sub, I mean, we're talking about a very, very, very small number relative to the $3,000 per sub that we're talking about. Now, I would say I'm not in the fiber manufacturing space. Someone would have to comment else, a Corning or someone else would have to comment on the fiber itself. But I would say the vast, vast majority of that $3,000 is in construction and other stuff. So I don't view this as a big economic factor.
Lori, Bill, what do you think of that? I mean, we're getting a pretty wide range of cost impact from these rules.
I completely agree. You look again, and my colleague Amit Patel in the chat there from Nokia, exactly right. The electronics are 5 to 10% of the cost of a project. 70% or more goes to construction and labor, which is true of every project. So, but yeah, I absolutely echo what Robert just said.
Yeah, totally agree. And particularly since they waived, the electronics portion in the waiver, it's just going to have a negligible impact on the cost of deployment.
I would also want to point out, I mean, that's why I mentioned labor at the beginning, because labor is the biggest cost and construction is the biggest cost of this, and we need to deal with that. Also, the cost of construction equipment, rentals, and production has also gone way up too. So those will also add to costs, and NTIA can't do anything about labor. Congress should, but they should also have waivers for construction equipment and so on.
Lots of other issues raising costs, from inflation to letter of credit to other rules we're not going to talk about here. But can I just get some clarity? What does it mean that the 55% threshold in electronic equipment has been waived? Does that mean that I mean, and maybe the best I can do is go back to Lori's two-part test, right? The 55% and the made in America. And since the 55% has been waived, I guess there's just one test for that. What could you get some clarity on what that waiver particularly means with regard to fiber electronic equipment?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, if you open up an OLT, an ONT, a router in your house, no matter what the broadband electronics are, you take the casing off, you look inside, there's potentially dozens or more components that comprise that product. The 55% test means 55% of the cost of those components is sourced in the United States. Today, most of those little parts and pieces come from all over the world, global supply chain. Semiconductor chips are the part that comprise the biggest majority of the price. So we know today that chips are not manufactured in the United States to meet those needs. So it's really hard to achieve the 55% with looking at the cost of the components and where they come from. So what NTIA did was recognize that fact. I mean, the chips issue is a decades-long problem that won't be solved until 2030, right? We won't see quantities rolling off of American factories until the end of the decade. So in order to alleviate that burden on manufacturing, they've waived the 55% rule for these 4 products. And they're saying it's much easier to meet the manufacturing processes as they are defined in the waiver. So that's what they did, is they alleviated the 55% problem and said, look, let's just focus on the manufacturing so that we can actually do this.
Lori, just a quick follow-up. How do optic modules fit into this group of electronic equipment? Are they, what is this technology and why is it important to be made in the United States?
So, optics modules are something that is a really interesting piece of technology. We heard loud and clear that the White House wanted fobs as a part of the manufacturing, but also it was important for them to move technology. And an optics module is a pluggable device that basically converts the packets of data from OLT into specific colors of lights that will be transmitted and received by fiber. Modules are important because you have different flavors depending on the speeds required by the use case, like GPON, XGS, 25 gig. So the operator needs flexibility to determine which optics modules they need to support their networks, and sometimes it's more than one. But optics is manufacturing right now is almost exclusively based in Southeast Asia. And so this is why moving optics modules to the US is so important. It's about securing supply chains for the highest tech pieces of equipment in the United States. And this enabling technology, is going to be onshored and supported by the BEAD program.
Bill, do you want to weigh in on the 55% threshold? What impact does that being waived have?
Well, I mean, the electronics alone, or if you look at the bill of materials for any of these products, the electronics are probably well over the majority of the bill of materials. So I think, NTIA was trying to reach a balance and saying that they want these 4 specific products manufactured in the U.S., but they realized, like Lori said, you just can't turn supply chains on a dime. And you don't want to delay deployment. And so they waived the 55% requirement.
Let's talk a little bit about the certification process. How is this going to work? And what do each of the panelists and also Scott think, not that you're not a panelist, what do each of the manufacturers and Scott feel about this process? And I don't know if it's a unique process that's been put in place. There's a certification, but there's also a list by the NTIA. So how is this going to work? Let's just go in the same order we've got here. So Robert, Lori, Bill, and Scott.
Yeah, I think some of the exact details of that will be still to be worked out, I guess the certification, but there are in the waiver, there are a set of specific guidelines of what it means to be manufactured in the US. So it's not simply like, I'm going to bring in products from Southeast Asia, repackage it in a different box, add a power supply, and call it made in America, right? So there is you actually have to be building, assembling PCBs. They go into these electronics and do a certain level of transformation and testing and validation. And so I assume there'll be some auditing process to validate that you actually do have facilities, that the label on the product ultimately in the end needs to say made in the USA when it comes off the assembly line as well. So a lot of that, I think just you'll have to have those products to validate them. They'll be added to a part number. Those part numbers, these SKUs will be added to a list of what's been certified as made in America. And that's a whole process that'll have to be worked out here over the next year.
And, there's precedent for creating qualified vendor lists. The U.S. government, federal agencies have done this before with other programs for clarity, for certainty. And states have as well. Many states have created qualified vendor lists for a variety of things, as well as on the negative side to bar companies from participation if they have been found to for malfeasance issues or whatnot. But at least for BEAD, for this program, there are multiple issues of compliance at play. The states are responsible for meeting the Buy America requirement, and then subsequently their subrecipients, the providers, are required to meet Buy America requirements. No one other than a manufacturer knows what's in their products and where the supply chains come from. So it's really an overly burdensome requirement to ask providers and states to vet supply chains. So what NTIA, I think, is reaching here with this is they recognize that burden, and they're trying to make it easier by saying, for companies that are manufacturing products, we want to protect your investment, and we want to make sure that states and providers have clarity on who and what products are Buy America compliant.
Yeah, I totally agree with Lori about that. I would say that, the certifications, in our opinion, need to be product specific, and they need to be current, not prospective. So in other words, an officer of the company, the manufacturer, under penalty, has to certify that those products have been manufactured in the US. We think it's important, again, that they specify which specific product and that it is a current certification, not a prospective certification.
We've had a number of questions. Oh, Scott, I didn't let you weigh in, please.
Yeah, my only opinion on it is that because this is something that it shouldn't exist, every dollar we spend on certification is a dollar not going to some better use. It's just a complete waste. Obviously, it has to happen given the law, but.
Okay. We've had a number of people ask about labor shortage. Okay. And again, we could talk about a lot about this, but is there any sense in linking this to the Buy America, because so much of the cost of BEAD deployment will be in labor? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm happy to talk again, but even if it's not part of the law, it's part of the requirements that increase costs. And to that extent, I think it's worth including in the conversation. And because, as I forget to tell you, someone in the audience pointed out, it's such a huge part of the costs. I mean, immigration is the only real way to deal with that, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite to do it.
Well, that'll be a topic we'll have to talk about another day, but I'm game for it, Scott. Let's give every one of you a chance to ask this wonderful question from Josh Williams. When it's all said and done, who are the winners and who are the losers of the Build America, Buy America law and waiver as proposed as it relates to BEAD? And we'll go in the same order we've gone in, and anything else you'd like to say as closing, please add on to that. So Robert, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the winners in our case, ultimately, hopefully, will be that there will be some job expansion. We've announced job expansion at our manufacturing center in Huntsville as part of this, and I'd certainly, hopefully, from a taxpayer's perspective, they see some value in that. And ultimately, like I said, I think between CHIPS bill and Buy America, I think the ultimate goal is by the end of this decade that you would have really, world-class scalable high-tech manufacturing here in the U.S. So I think there is some long-term advantages to having that, more secure supply chain domestically. So, I mean, as far as losers, I mean, I was, to Scott's point, I still think the cost is negligible. So I don't see any real losers in this, because I don't feel like we're talking about some meaningful cost burden that's being in place. Obviously, there's some work on our side to make all this possible, but I don't see any meaningful losers necessarily in this.
Lori?
So, the winners ultimately are the folks that are going to be connected by the BEAD program, right? I mean, this is why we're doing this. We have 8 million plus unserved locations according to the fabric, and as many as up to 20 million underserved locations. This entire program and all of its mandates, including Buy America, is meant to be able to serve every single household in this country with high-tech, robust equipment so that we can lead the world in connectivity. And so, establishing supply chains and an ecosystem in the U.S. for high-tech manufacturing, taking that away from Southeast Asia is a huge win for the administration and the American people. I'm not going to get into picking losers. I'm only picking winners.
Okay. Thank you, Lori. Bill.
Yeah. Lori's right again on the big winners in this are the people that are going to get connected that don't have high-speed internet right now. And let's just remember that, there's probably 25 billion of broadband stimulus funding flowing through the system right now between capital project funds, USDA Reconnect, RDOF, tribal connectivity program, et cetera. I mean, the BEAD money hasn't even hit the street. So, hopefully we'll never have another pandemic in which we have to go into lockdown and we're all working remotely. But if we do, we're going to be a lot better prepared because of this program. I think, the impacts, as we've said about Buy America, Build America, as far as, cost of deployment are negligible. I think, it will result in jobs staying here and being added here. But the biggest winner, in my opinion, is the American taxpayer. They get a return on their investment, not just for, broadband connectivity, but they get jobs here. So that's my thought.
All right, Scott.
Yeah, the winners, I would say there are 3 groups. The first is politicians who like to go around and talk about Buy America programs. It's always been popular. It always will be. They love it. The second group of winners are firms that provide inputs into the process of building broadband. And the third is lawyers who will get to write comments to NTIA about the waivers and other factors that they need to do to comply with Buy America. And the losers are very clearly American broadband consumers, because Buy America raises costs, and those costs come from providing broadband. And that's my conclusion.
Well, it's been a wonderful, and it has been provocative discussion. It is, I think, worth pointing out that the NTIA has really wrestled with this issue very closely. We've watched it, we've observed it very closely, and as they've had to manage what clearly is coming from the top, injunctions from the administration to have Buy America rules throughout the whole of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, they seem to have done as good a job as they could have in this process. And it is very exciting to see the energy and the interest in manufacturing in the United States. And we haven't talked a lot about the chips issue, right? Which has huge strategic dimensions, I've come to realize. And I'm grateful that we've been able to get these 4 experts. And so on behalf of them, thank you to each of our panelists, Robert Conger, Lori Adams, Bill Sproul, and Scott Walston. Until next week, I am Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next